Kevin, great to have you on the show. So, for anybody here who's listening, Kevin is an attorney in the DC area. We're going to cover some really exciting topics. Some people might find legal and tax topics not the most exciting, but our clients tend to be very detail oriented. We work with a lot of very technical professionals, and especially in the Washington, DC area, Kevin sees we work with a lot of the exact same type of clients, people that are technical professionals, people that want to get down into the information, and people that actually want to know the detail. They don't just want the work done, they want to understand why it is, why it is they're getting it done this way. And before the call, we talked about a few kind of updates that we're seeing in laws having to do with estates and inheritances. And so let's jump right into that. I want Kevin to kind of give a breakdown about this because this is something that I'm personally interested in. So I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me start just tell you a little bit about myself. And so I am in the estate planner arena here in DC and do work kind of around the country. And I used to be in the foreign service. I was there for 10 years and left, and really love doing estate planning because it is a complex field, which I love, and also it's about helping people, which is what I also love doing too. I think the biggest change, which has been in the news a lot, is with the big beautiful bill and the changes to the estate tax with that. And back around 2020, 21, I'd say, going back a few years, there was a lot of talk around eliminating, step up in basis and dramatically lowering the estate tax exemption um, to a very low amount. And so what I advise clients to just let's take a wait and see approach. Then 2024 happened with the new administration coming in this year. And again, just kind of wait and see. And I said I would, amounts were supposed to sunset in to 2017. And I said I would be shocked if they did that, which, then they passed this bill. And so increase the exemption up to $15 million and say they're gonna make that permanent as well. So, I think that really doesn't affect a lot of people, but for those it does affect, it's a big change because that's a huge, huge amount of money, $30 million that will be exempt. DC stayed where it was, this year, roughly right at $5 million exemption. So I think that surprises people somewhat, is that relatively low because DC being a expensive area, you can have one or two pieces of property and some retirement accounts and get over that threshold, and it's not
I have a
portable to
question about
sell.
that.
Yeah,
You brought sometimes even just one property, depending on how long ago they
yeah,
purchased it. But that aside, now one topic of confusion here has to do with the 15, because in a way it's really 30, right? Because you're using both spouses. Now,
right.
can you explain a little bit about that for some of our listeners, and also a little bit about how does DC have something like this?
Yeah, so that each, if you think about it, each person born in the U.S. gets kind of like a coupon that's worth now $15 million, and so if you give above a certain amount, I believe it's $19,000 this year, you're supposed to file a gift tax return along with your tax return, just letting the government know, hey, I gave $50,000 this year, so I'm over by 30,000. And then just keep a running tab. So they'll take off that $30,000. And so over your lifetime, you're given an exemption amount, which again is currently 15 million. A married couple has $30 million, right? So double that. And you know, I don't, George, I know that you do what's called a 706 return. And so you can also, if one spouse dies away with a significant amount or some amount of their unused coupon, then it can be used by the surviving spouse. And so it's a really powerful tool for larger estates. And so DC, give you a little bit of history. They used to be harmonized with the federal tax rate. And then in 2020, with COVID coming, they said, "Look, it's looking like our tax base, our revenue is going to be dramatically affected in a negative way. We need to raise revenue, and an estate tax is one way to do that." And so they decoupled from the federal tax rate and made it a quite a bit lower. At the time, the federal was at, I believe, 11 million, 10 million. and they lowered that to 4 million, which now with inflation is 5. But the key issue there is it's not portable, meaning that you don't get that spousal portion. So you really have to be careful, because first of all, people were surprised that it's so low, but they're also surprised that you can't double it for a spouse. So did that
Yeah,
answer
I'm
your
very
question?
yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised about that as well. Now,
Yeah.
can you tell me a little bit, because we're focusing here on the whole DMV area. Do you know anything about how this could have if any Maryland or Virginia equivalents of this?
Yeah, Virginia is in the area of the 3 states, Virginia, Maryland, well, 2 states and a jurisdiction. Virginia does not have an estate or an inheritance tax. Maryland does have both, but typically what people think of more is the inheritance tax, and so there are several key exemptions with that. So if a spouse inherits, children inherit, for example, they're going to be exempt from that tax. And so, that's something to watch out for. I think also since we're in the area, also Pennsylvania has I think a pretty hefty inheritance tax. It's 4.5% for example, children that inherit. So, um, that can surprise people as well. And I'll just note, I had someone come in a while ago, and DC resident facing somewhat significant estate tax. And they said, look, I just got a terminal illness. I've got less than a month to live, and I couldn't move jurisdictions to Virginia to escape this tax. There's no time left. So I think it's always important to know what these taxes are, know when they change, and then really how they can affect your estate. Because it's I think with some good planning, especially beforehand when people are younger, I think a lot with the use of insurance as well. It's a tax you don't really have to incur. I mean, completely above board, but you can plan it accordingly and make sure that at least you minimize those taxes.
Mm, As you were speaking, I was writing down. I have so many more questions, and these are things that come up on consultations with our clients all the time, and from a tax perspective. But so any of this, any kind of way you can answer this is great. The One of the things you hinted at is the client that was in Pennsylvania finding a way for them to move to DC. Can you explain a little bit about how far in advance does this need to happen? What are the mechanics of this? What do
Yeah.
you need to watch out for? What assets can be where? If you have a home in X state, etc. Can you just go over a
Yeah.
specific
So
scenario?
yeah. So it's actually DC to Virginia is what they were hoping to accomplish. And so, in general, jurisdictions to look at what real property has, financial assets, things like that, and they tax kind of the value of the estate at death. And so, I don't know the specific time limits per jurisdiction, but you know, jurisdictions are going to want their tax revenue, right? And so they're going to do everything in their power to say this person left in not enough time. I could find out the specific time limits, but each jurisdiction has it. You have to be a resident for X number of months or to be able to take advantage of these, or obviously people would move one day if they knew that they're going to die. Um, and to escape that tax. So they really work hard to make it as difficult as possible. I wouldn't say typical as possible, but just, they want to make sure that they try to collect their revenue.
What's the tax rate? Because you mentioned some percentages for Pennsylvania. What's the tax rates that taxpayers can expect in an inheritance tax situation if they're above the threshold,
Yeah,
DC
no,
or
it's a
in
good question.
Maryland?
So I'll start with federal. Federal is above the 30 million is 40%. Then DC, it's a graduated, tops out at 16%. I believe it starts at 8 or 8.8. And then
It's already high.
maxes out. Yeah, exactly. And then Maryland, I know their estate tax is 10% above 5 million, and their inheritance tax is, I believe, 2%. Um, Give me 1 second here. I just want to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sure
Take your time.
I've got, Yeah, it's a 10% inheritance tax rate, that is applied. But again, I think of all the just or of the area, Maryland has pretty good exemptions as far as who gets to inherit tax exempt. So the tax rate would be 0% for instance, like children that inherit in Maryland, versus Pennsylvania. Going back to that, it's for children inherit it, but they still have to pay 4.5%. So
Got it.
it's
So
pretty
can
high.
you explain the difference between these taxes? One that is on maybe explain the mechanics of what the children are paying versus what maybe the state as a whole is paying, and a little bit of the interchange between those.
Sure. So the estate tax, when you think of it, it's what the value of your estate is. So if your estate is worth, let's just say you're $1 million over that federal tax rate, then you're going to pay $400,000 in estate tax. So it's taken off from the estate, and that can cause quite significant issues, especially if the example that gets I think in the past used a lot is the farmer that has a family farm for 10 generations worth a lot, and it gets taxed at the estate tax level, and they don't have the cash to pay for it, so they have to sell the farm, and the family's upset and stuff. So tragic situation. So that's the estate tax. Inheritance is what you receive. So the child would be responsible for that inheritance tax. And so again, if you have a piece of real property and that's the only item of value, and let's say it's a family home with a lot of sentimental value, but you owe this estate tax or inheritance tax, depending upon which one, that can cause a lot of problems for the family because they might be forced to sell that property.
Now this you're bringing up tons of great points. The one of them which I've had on the show somebody that works in insurance, and we went over a little bit of this, but kind of from your perspective, because a lot of our professions, whether somebody is in legal, whether somebody is in accounting, whether somebody is in financial advisory, whether in their insurance, there's certain things where there's tons of overlap. Right.
Yeah.
So now, from your perspective, you mentioned how estate taxes, in a way, are optional taxes. This is really interesting for me. And this is something very interesting for all my clients. And I'm sure a lot of people in the country. Can you explain a little bit about
Yeah, I mean,
how
if yeah, sure. And you know, if you take a business person, they're building their business, they're growing, etc. Typically, they don't have the time to think about what happens if I die, because myself included, we all act like we're going to live forever, right? But that's not the case. And so you can start to amass a very large estate without no way. And I'll give you a really good example is, people that were early investors in either a stock or say crypto, and now they are sitting on a lot of value. And so, coming to the realization that they could potentially owe a lot of estate tax. So you can use various techniques. If you get a really large estate, what typically suggest is looking at something like, 'cause what you want to do is try to reduce the value of your estate through either creating structures like, partnerships, or a vehicle that, bona fide valuation, because it's not marketable and you don't have ownership, it's worth less than what it would if it was 100% ownership. So you can reduce the value that way. If you want to get lower than that, you can start to look at vehicles like charitable trusts. So you get some immediate tax benefit from that. Um, and then also some charitable event at the end of that, depending on type of structure. But I think also, the use of insurance, and I have to tell myself I didn't know a tremendous amount about insurance till I had a client with an extremely large estate and started looking at various insurance solutions. And so, one that I did a lot of research on was the premium finance. I don't know if you're familiar with that product, but you're essentially borrowing part of the premium from a bank to purchase the the policy. And so over time, like, and this is a long-term play, but over time, that the value of that policy should grow significantly in the cash value, and you can start to borrow against that tax-free, when you're 60 or 70, because if you're living that long, you should live to around 80 or 90. And so, there's risks involved with that. I'm certainly not a finance professional, but I really think having items like that in place are really important. The very easiest, least expensive option is to purchase term life insurance. Obviously, it goes away, but again, planning for the worst case. I'm I'm not young anymore, and so I have $1 million policy. I think I pay like $150 a month. And so again, just in case if something happens, you have that cash event, and to help cushion expensive and potential taxes.
Because insurance is not taxable. When you die, an
Exactly.
insurance payout is not taxable. So there are a lot of creative ways, and I think that they may be outside of the kind of subject matter of this call, just because
Yeah.
I don't think either of us are licensed insurance agents. I asked
So
one years ago.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not. That's not my. I don't have a real passion for insurance, but I know that I do have a passion for helping clients, and that's one tool. And I really wanted to learn about it in the best way. And I love taking tests too. So that was one way to kind of kill two birds with one stone.
One other thing that kind of came up is a thought that I wanted you to kind of explain a little bit. When there is this estate tax, let's say that's a $31 million estate, so they have $1 million over the 30 million limit,
Yeah.
then they're paying this $400,000 federal, which is huge already.
Yeah.
This is a huge amount of tax.
And then you
Okay,
get DC if you're on top of that. So you're looking at 56% tax rate, which is
right. And
a
so
lot.
this individual in this example worked their whole life and already paid possibly 40-50% tax rate on it, depending on which state they were in and how they structure their business. And then they're paying another. So it's like they got taxed 80%, right? And then if you include real estate taxes and sales taxes on certain luxury purchases, and when it's kind of they ended up getting taxed this outrageous amount when all is said and done.
Yeah.
Isn't this kind of similar with the estate and then afterwards the inheritance tax on the children? Doesn't that end up becoming a double taxation situation as well?
I mean, one could make that argument, absolutely, and I'm not here to argue one side or the other. The argument on the other side is that these taxes were set up to not, if you go back to England, and you had a massive accumulation of wealth, which again, I'm not. It's just what it is that the estate tax works to help to eliminate that and kind of have new generations come up, and because if you have massive concentration in wealth, that can sometimes lead to some deleterious effects in theory. So again, I'm an estate planning attorney. I'm not a pundit or politician. So, but yeah, and I mean, one could definitely make the argument that you got taxed once on this. Is it fair to tax a second or third time? And I think plenty of people would say no, that's not fair.
Right, right, right. Yeah. I mean, I hear it also from the client's point of view. And I mean, both of us in professional services. And if you're in this business for a long period of time, you start to accumulate assets too. So this
Yeah,
is
I mean,
something that's relevant to all of us, you know?
yeah, and I know that the people I know that are most successful in not just from a financial standpoint, but in any endeavor, they're working incredible hours. I mean, I know I get in at 5 o'clock in the morning and I'm not done till whenever. And because I'm passionate about what I do and I want to do a good job, but also I like to work hard. And so yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I understand 100%. Because this does start to flow into kind of a belief type of conversation
Yeah.
is what do you think is fair? Is it kind of some people weren't giving them the opportunity So is it fair that others that did get an opportunity for an education, for a career, to have their money taken and redistributed to those that were kind of had an unfair upbringing? That's one kind of theory of fairness. And then there's another one where it's like, I'm working 100 hours a week. This is my stuff. That's another kind of, it's like two
Yeah.
different philosophies on what's actually fair.
Yeah, it is, and I do believe that at least in this country, and we hear this a lot, but if you're willing to put in the time and the effort and really take some calculated risks, but just work hard, I think you'll generally be rewarded for it. And in the time I was in the foreign service, I saw this time and again, not just in the U.S. but other countries, people working really hard and putting their time into it, and some from extremely humble beginnings reaching the pinnacles of their various professions, you know?
Now, specifically for inheritances, when is the age where you advise your clients to really start taking it seriously? I mean, obviously, some things can happen to anybody, so you want to have
Yeah.
a plan in place no matter the age. But when is it that you say, okay, definitively, now you absolutely need to get started on this?
N
When is that?
and I know when I say this, people are gonna go, "Yeah, he's saying that because he's a estate planning attorney," but, I mean, you look at actuarial tables, right? And you know that statistically, I'm probably gonna live to be in my 80s, but there are outliers and things happen, and I have had clients that were young, I mean, really young, that have passed away for, accidents, various things, freak situations, terminal illnesses, um, and and the most difficult time, I think, is when it's a last case and I'm brought into the hospital to work on this, and it's that's the last thing that someone wants to have to do when they're facing, their own mortality. And so, I think having time to think through that is very important. I really there's a couple of I think of all the demographics that I work with that is critically important is, the one with families with kids or, individuals with children. Because if, again, always planning for the worst case, if something were to happen, and there's no planning in place, that has a lot of effects for a very long time for those children. And so having those plans in place, I think, are critically important for that group.
Right. I was watching some I watched these kind of I've watched a few documentaries about long-term wealth, and one of them it compared different New York families from the Gilded
Yeah.
Age,
Yeah.
and which ones the wealth became multi-generational,
Yes.
where the grandchildren's grandchildren still have plenty of assets and tons of financial power versus ones that didn't, and what they did differently in both of those cases.
Absolutely. There are absolutely ways with thoughtful planning to, if and I've worked with clients on this that are have substantial means that, they want to be able to perpetuate that for many generations. And so you can absolutely set that up. I think key to that is having some sort of governance structure within the family. So they meet as a board, for example, and they think about, how do we shepherd and utilize our resources for the long term? And that takes a lot of work, and it takes at the beginning and ongoing. But yeah, if you look at a great example is the Astors versus the Rockefellers. And the Rockefellers were thoughtful and are still going, and the Astors pretty much spent it all. So, um, I think a lot of people accumulate a lot of assets, and again, again, no judgment here, but they're not thoughtful about how do we make sure that that gets passed on in a manner that perpetuates it, but also doesn't, I think, have the probability of enabling children and grandchildren to just live off the estate and not reach their full potential, whatever that is. And that's a balance. That's a real balance.
What do you think about do you have any experience with generation skipping trusts?
Not a tremendous amount. It is one technique. Think, I think the number of estates in 2024 that had an estate tax was something like 2,000 out of, I think, 10 to 12 million people died in 2024. So a minute amount of people, I think, and it's even smaller now with that. But I'd love to learn more about what prompted that question. Like what,
I was just thinking about ways where we're talking about this, kind of generally, kind of multiple generations
yeah.
having, and I also like what you said about the family governance, about having kind of rules in place and a culture within the family in place of responsibility.
Yeah. Well,
Mhm.
one thing I'm still working on, and it's a challenge, is that a structure whereby, again, using insurance, and I'm working with insurance people that really know insurance, that there's a component whereby insurance is purchased on the, the children or grandchildren, and a two-thirds of that or one-third of that has to go back into the trust or the estate. And that could, in theory, keep things in perpetuity for a very, very long time. Um, Again, it's very careful planning, and it goes back again to that governance structure, which is extremely important as well. But I think you can definitely set up these type of structures with some thoughtful planning. And one thing I've really been interested in is how do we bring that to people, not with $100 million, but $2 or $3 million, because life throws curveballs at everybody. And if you have something set up whereby, if you could at least pay for health and education for kids or grandkids or great great grandkids, at least you will leave this world knowing that successive generations are taken care of.
For the ones with the 2 or 3 million in net worth, I mean, when you think about it, a lot of it may be tied up in the home. So
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
right. So let's say there's a situation where somebody has $2 million in their retirement plans,
yeah,
and the home is worth 1.5 million, and now they're starting to reach a certain age. Well, other than we're kind of you brought up something just a moment ago where you said health.
yeah,
What people are in these kinds of situations where, a- and even if there's no major kind of illness that requires tons of medical spending, let's say they're in a situation where they need to be put in some type of an assisted living facility.
yeah,
These can be extremely expensive. And I spoke with an attorney in Maryland maybe 2, 3 years ago, and he had some interesting things to say about planning for that. And I don't know if this is something that really that
Y-
you look at a lot, but do you have any kind of insight on this?
yeah. So there's the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, so MAPT, and essentially what you're doing is, as the individual is, and practice, and in actuality, you are divesting yourself of all your assets. So on paper, and in reality, you have no assets. You typically will have the children be the trustees, and you've got to go on faith here that they're going to do right by you. And because there's no ownership or control of those assets, if an event happens where you have to go to a facility, um, then you are below that threshold, and you don't have to draw down your estate for that care. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it looks like. Now there's a 5-year look back rule, so that if you're, you and I get people that call me, they're like, my mom is about to go to a facility, and is there any way we can do anything? And you can't, because and in between that two, there's that period, it becomes a math calculation as to what is the cost of the facility if we set it up now, and they might have to go in 2 years. Does it make sense to do that? So you could figure that out. But there's a big but there, in that, um, you don't know exactly what type of facility you're gonna go to with Medicaid. And secondly, with the big beautiful bill, as we all know, one of the big components of that was a pretty dramatic reduction of Medicaid. And so if you plan for if you use the MAPT with the idea of going to something that's going to be reimbursed by Medicaid, but that piece of it's missing, what's going to happen then? And so, I always advise clients to think really hard about doing this because there's several assumptions that have to turn out for it to work out okay. And so I think a big one is you have to ask yourself, if my child needed that money versus caring for me, even though it's my money in their name, are they going to come through with that? And so that's just kind of reality. And some people they know their kids well enough that yes, I absolutely believe they're not wouldn't do anything untoward, but it's a risk that you can't quantify.
Yeah, you know, one of you reminded me of something when you were talking about all these factors coming together in order to make something make sense or not. I have something that we saw a few years ago where there was this talk, and it partially got done, where there was a lot of talk about student loan forgiveness.
Yes.
And we started getting in these situations where, and you already know where I'm going, where, young couple in their 30s, married, just married, and you already know kind of the mind scramble that's happening. And at one point, I even had a template that I would just give clients, like, since you already went in this direction, I'm going to give you this template. It's like, okay, so if this gets forgiven, this administration would have to do this, 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 and this. If it gets forgiven under the current rules, you're going to be paying tax on the whole amount. So if it's $100,000 that gets forgiven, what's your ordinary tax rate? You're going to be paying taxes on that. But what if you're filing separately? And if you file separately, then your income is under this threshold. But what if it's going to be in 5 years? But what
Yeah.
about in 10? But what about when you forgive it? But what's going to be a tax rate then? And what
Yeah.
administration is going to be in charge? And how are they going to change it? And what is the administration that made these changes now? If they change them later, how is that going to affect everything that you did up until that point later when it gets changed? And how is it going to get changed? And
Right.
so I typed basically that whole thing up professionally in
Yeah.
probably a page about this long.
Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
a client just went in that direction, I said, if you're going to go into that mental deadlock, here are the variables.
Right.
Now, we can do an analysis on each one of these and kind of do a decision tree, and I don't think you need that. And so clients would see that and be like, you know what, I'm just going to go with my gut. And I say, well, that might be a good.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you want to get on a consultation with a professional, but there's some type of situations like this, Kevin. There's so many examples where you have to make the best decision with what you have.
100%. And that's why when clients come to me and they see that the estate plan that I've created for them is like hundreds of pages, like I have no idea what's going to happen in their lives. They don't know what's going to happen in their lives, but we're going to try to cover at least 95% of it or 99%. Um, and you do the best with what you can and say, okay, on a standard distribution curve, we're gonna 2, 3 standard deviations out. And if something like a meteor strike, well, we've got that covered. But if something truly bizarre happens, you can't have everything in a document or know everything about a certain tax strategy or situation because there's so many variables involved. And that's I think it goes back to the complexity of life. You try to plan for what you can and then try to minimize the risks of things you can't or don't know.
What did you think about irrevocable trusts?
So I think they're definitely they are a tool in the toolbox, so to speak. I think that again, one should think very carefully about them because they are hard to modify. It's extremely difficult to get assets out of those irrevocable trusts. So I think talking with the professional and thinking long and hard about that is extremely important because as we know, even you take the Murdochs. I mean, he tried to change his irrevocable trust when he wasn't happy with some of his kids, and he couldn't do it. And so and here's somebody that has, you know, is able to have the best lawyers in the country working. on his issues, and so still couldn't change with that. But again, in certain situations, they're very important. One thing I will bring up, and you might have clients ask this, with LLCs as well. They're like, oh, I want to put my property into an LLC or a trust, and for some sort of protection, et cetera. And so I think what a lot of them don't appreciate is that there's that transfer tax involved with that. And I mean, do you see that a lot? Because it's not inexpensive to do
I see that
transfer tax.
I see that often ignored or brushed off or not even
Really?
analyzed. Yeah. hmm
But do you
Now,
find
little. Mhm.
they get taxed on it? I mean, they have to owe it, right?
So when it comes to people that are property tax flippers, or pardon me, property flippers that are they're purchasing homes, fixing them up, selling them, people that own multiple pieces of real estate, people that are shifting assets in and out of LLCs that they own for purposes of this. These are very, we're talking about earlier in the call, extremely technical professionals that, may be working. I think even before we got on the call, we talked just kind of personally about how many
Yeah.
clients we have at places like the IMF and the World Bank and UN, and how many clients that we'll have. They're in extremely technical positions that may be working at the universities. People that are entrepreneurs, oftentimes by nature, are very different. Okay, they're not going to be as studious, and part of entrepreneurism involves, in a way, what I've seen, a lot of disregard for a lot of the rules that some of us as professionals say, well, insane. Why don't you think of it? My experience has been, we have entrepreneur clients who say, how many transactions did you do last year? That we're doing rehabs and flips. I don't know, maybe 6 or 7. I'm not sure. It's all. I give you my statements. You're looking at bank statements that make no sense. Is that okay? Well, this expense, which property did it go to? I don't know. Just go through it and figure it out. That's what I'm paying you for. What
Yeah.
am I paying you for? Right. So, Kevin, I don't know if how much you get that, but I found that there's two kind of types, subsets of clients. There's ones,
Yeah.
they're very entrepreneur, they're to that extent where they do not want to know anything about what it is that we're doing. And then there's ones that, and then there's another variety, and this one we don't get much in the DC area, or I have a large concentration of clients in other places that are very similar to the DC area, like New
Yep.
York, etc. There's also another type of client where they think that the accountant's job is to make sure they pay no taxes at all,
Yep.
regardless of how much income they earn. And I say to myself, wait a minute. So you expect me to do something that's not right on your returns? Of
Yeah.
course. Is that your job? So, I mean, there's a lot of, it, as professional service providers, we see a lot of different segments of society and mentalities as to what it is that we do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess when I look at myself, like I would, first of all, I wouldn't do it, but I would be afraid from, on one hand, like, what if 5 years go by and I haven't paid this tax? Like, you're going to have to pay the tax, then the penalties, then the interest. And so you're looking at a large potential liability. And, I always counsel, and I have fewer entrepreneurs than I do professionals, right? And so I think more, or I should say less risk tolerance, right? And so they are turned off about, yeah, they have to balance that. If I put an LLC, do I want to pay that transfer tax? And because typically they aren't real estate investors, and so this is their one piece of real estate that they rent out in a certain jurisdiction. So, yeah, no, that's interesting.
Now, since you brought that up, obviously, anytime that we have a client that brings up a situation that we think is ethically incorrect, or there's a possibility of some type of a rule that's broken, we immediately disengage, only because, for license purposes,
Yeah,
it's very important that we're ethical, but also just for pure ethics too. It's just not a side of, anything that I want to be involved in. Um, Now, kind of all that aside, sometimes I see people that have structures that I would consider to be questionable, and then it's a matter of kind of how you see it. Now, there's things that are black and white, obviously, but then there's others that are kind of like, is this a tax controversy case or
Yeah.
a structure? Do you see that sometimes? And kind of what's something that you've seen that you thought to yourself, oh, this is very smart, and then you really thought about it and said, wait a minute, I don't know if this is right.
Yeah, no, I recently had someone reach out to me about a structure to I mean, essentially what it came down to was that it it really struck me as some sort of and I'm gonna give this person who's not a client or period, is that, you know, it looked like some kind of mortgage fraud situation. I don't know if they, knew what they were doing. I noticed that it looked like it was generated by ChatGPT, which I don't know if you're getting more of that now, but I am. People that are adamant that, well, ChatGPT told me I could do this, and I'm like, well, have ChatGPT write your documents because I can't do that. Which is really interesting because they're adamant that because it's ChatGPT created, it has to be right, and it's not at all. And so yeah, so that did come up, but I quickly had to said this, I can't help you with this. Because like you, I just hey, I don't just internally, I'm always want to be 100% honest and upfront, but just from a self preservation standpoint, I don't want to get in trouble with the bar.
Well, it's a really good point. What's the kind of personality that becomes an attorney or a CPA or something or an architect? These are people
Yeah,
risk averse.
exactly.
Risk averse.
Exactly. No, I like to color within the lines and not, again, I don't mind taking calculated risks, but I know I have some clients that take what I would consider wild risks on business and things like that that I don't have that DNA that to have the comfort level to do that. And yeah, you're exactly right. Like we're I think rule followers.
There's a thing that I've noticed that when ChatGPT, when people started to really embrace it, I'm getting more and more where they went on a tangent, and I don't like. I subscribe to a bunch of different newspapers, like the Wall Street Journal, the New York
Yeah.
Times, all these, and they all have like supposed different political leanings or whatever. But there was one that was in the New York Times, and I think either Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal basically ripped off the whole article essentially and wrote a different spin on it. But basically, it was that ChatGPT really tells you what you want to hear, and the
Yeah.
software is made to just kind of notice when you type in a prompt, wow, that was so insightful of you to ask this question, and then it
Yeah.
answers to say, but you don't have to butter me up. And I've even told ChatGPT
Yeah.
before, don't butter me up, tell me if but what I found is, um ask the same question on a few different people's computer, you'll get a different answer. And ask the same question on Perplexity, which I started to use more now versus ChatGPT. I found ChatGPT was really, tooting my own horn too much.
I
And
agree.
on Perplexity will tell you more often when you're wrong and why.
Yeah, and I read an article that ChatGPT is a lot like the founder of ChatGPT or the big, Sam Altman that he has that personality. So then it becomes is ChatGPT kind of a mirror or has his traits in it. So it's pretty fascinating article. And I don't know, but yeah, I use 2 or 3 now because I'm fascinated by it, but I'm also wary of just one because, it can give you a wrong answer and one that just doesn't make sense. But, I've been able to spot when potential clients give me, like, one was giving me this trust I'd never heard of before. And it was some arcane, I didn't even get it. And so, but he got it through ChatGPT and was just adamant that this was the way to go. So,
Well, so I think that my assistant before the call gave us some topics that we should cover. I don't know if we covered any of them, but I'm really happy about a lot of the
this
things
is
that we did.
great.
Yeah.
I really have enjoyed this conversation and, thank you for having me on and would love to come again.
Yeah. And just another idea, if you do think of, or if anybody's watching this and thinks of any topics that specifically either of us should cover, just let us know in the comments or send us an email. Kevin's information is going to be somewhere around this, depending on what, this is going to go on TikTok, it'll go on Instagram Reels, it'll go on uh, uh, Twitter, which is now X. It will go on our LinkedIn, it'll go on our website. So regardless of where you see it, find a way to reach out to us. We're going to have Kevin's information there. We're going to have my information there. If there's other things that you want us to cover, a lot of times, and you'll notice this in the conversation, we're talking about one thing, a million other questions come up. Ask us any of these questions. Kevin will let you know, oh, this is too personal tax oriented. You should speak with George. There's things that you ask that have to do with estate and trust structures from the legal side that we can't help you with. We'll do the same thing. We'll say you need to speak with Kevin or his team about this. So basically, find out a way to reach us. And just another top level thing, and I'm sure this applies to Kevin. We work with clients all over the country as well as internationally. There are certain
Yeah.
topics that go across multiple states, and also, Kevin may be barred in many different states. Our license transfers to all 50 states. We have clients in something like 49, 50 states for many years now. So don't feel constrained and say, "Hey, I need to find something I can drive to." Reach out, and we'll let you know. So
Yeah, and I want to put a plug in for you, George. If I have a tax issues that comes up, I immediately think of George because you're very responsive and helpful and knowledgeable. So, and that's exactly what you're looking for in a very complex topic that you don't want to get wrong. So, thank you.
thank you. Super appreciate it. Yeah, so that's it for today's show. But yeah, reach out to us anytime.
All right, thank you so much. Take care. Bye bye.